The first video I made on this channel was about a year ago, a review of the then recently released Trails from Zero. Despite my failed attempts to pull off deadpan, I'm mostly content with that video in terms of how I describe the game. Since then, there's been 3 more Trails titles released in the West, and Trails Through Daybreak has finally been announced for a localization. But I haven't really felt the need to cover them since I felt like I'd said my piece on the series already. But a few things happened that made me change my mind, and I feel like now I have more I want to say. The first is what I originally planned to make a review on this month. I've only really covered JRPGs on this channel, which wasn't on purpose. It just so happened that the first 2 games I wanted to talk about were Shin Megami Tensei and Trails, and now I'm afraid if I cover anything else I'll die, like a shark that can't stop swimming. But I had planned to break out of that this month and talk about a Western game, specifically Starfield. However, as I played through it, I just felt so dramatically underwhelmed that I knew I couldn't really make a video on it. Starfield just felt so unmemorable and safe, to the extent that having uninstalled it a week ago, I can only remember the names of like 2 characters in the whole thing. So naturally, this led me to wanting to talk about something completely the opposite. Instead of something uninspired spat out by a $7.5 billion company, I want to talk about a smaller game that sticks out in my mind months after playing it. And so I think this is a good opportunity to hit 2 birds with 1 stone. I get to talk about a game that I actually like and simultaneously sort of explain why I've covered JRPGs so much on this channel. So let's talk about Trails to Azure. Trails is a series of RPGs by Falcom that has been going for almost 20 years now, and it represents something quite unique in video games, that being continuity. Every Trails title released in that 20-year span has taken place in the same world in the same time period. Characters from one series will often cross over to another, culminating in Cold Steel 3 and 4, which is essentially the anime version of Infinity War. While this may not sound unique, it's rare to see something like this from a heavily story-focused game. There are certainly franchises that have connective tissue between releases, but it's tough to think of many video game franchises that have a 20-year-long continuous story in the way Trails has. But while that may be notable from an outside perspective, that isn't really why Trails has its rather rabid following. While there are common elements between the different titles, most specifically the antagonists, each new arc focuses on a new cast of party members in a new setting with a new central focus. Trails in the Sky FC, Trails from Zero, and Trails of Cold Steel each represent entirely new stories which then evolve over a few games. In this sense, each arc is basically just one extremely long game. And so while this video is about Trails to Azure, it's really going to lump Trails from Zero in with it because they aren't really separate entities in anything but name. We're headed into spoiler territory for both games. Trails to Azure takes place in Crossbell, a buffer state caught between 2 larger countries. Its location has led to it being somewhat of a political powder keg as both neighbors jostle to take control. This was done indirectly through political corruption, but after the events of Trails from Zero, both countries are now more directly trying to take control. This leads to Crossbell's new leader declaring independence as even more groups try to influence the state from behind the scenes, including a group of returning antagonists from Trails in the Sky. You play as the Special Support Section, a division of the Crossbell Police meant to improve public image by assisting the citizens. On top of the 4 returning characters from Zero, 2 new characters have been promoted from NPC status into being full-time party members. This includes a guy named Wazi Hemisphere, a name so stupid I imagine it was only included to distract from the fact that another character is named Randy Orlando. The game follows the same structure as Zero up until about the halfway point. You'll be sent on various odd jobs to areas around the city, and as you go you get hints about a larger story playing out in the background. At the halfway point, some major shit goes down, Crossbell declares independence, and the game continues escalating from there. This game is sort of the prime example for why the initial slow boil of Trails games pays off. The game goes from doing glorified chores to fighting a cosmic force with the power of a god, as of course is JRPG tradition. Because this is the second game, it has a much faster pace than Zero, which only really had stuff happen in the final chapters. Still, it's a slower start than a lot of games out there. Much like Zero, this is very purposeful as it establishes the setting well so you'll actually care when stuff happens to it. As far as the gameplay goes, it's mostly unchanged from Zero. It's pretty standard turn-based stuff, with special moves and magic and monsters and all that. It gets the job done for the most part. It has some interesting mechanics in how you can construct builds for characters, the bosses are suitably challenging, and overall it just doesn't do anything to detract from the experience. The one complaint I do have is a lot of your special moves are meant to debuff or inflict status on enemies, and as the game goes along, most things are heavily resistant to both of those. But by the time combat starts to drag a little bit, I was way too invested in the story to care. Look, I'm kind of breezing through this stuff because it's not really what's important here. If you want some more details, you can check out my review of Zero, which I'll link in the description. But I don't want to talk about this game because of its combat or really anything involving the gameplay. This is a heavily story-based game, which means it better be a damn good story, and I want to explain how it achieved that. The thing that these games do so well and what justifies the slow pace and two-game structure is the character arcs. Trails is in a unique spot in how it allows for characters to develop naturally over the course of a long time while weaving those developments in with the main story. This is the main appeal of Trails and the reason it has that rabid following I mentioned earlier. It does this well enough to the point where you actually care that characters show up in later arcs because of how much you've grown to like them. Let's talk about a few examples on how they do this. Let's look at one of the main party members, the aforementioned and hilariously named Randy Orlando. Starting in Zero, he's introduced 5 minutes into the game and his personality is established as pretty laid back. As the first title moves along, two things are reinforced. First, that he's more reliable than he appears, and second, that he clearly has some stuff in his past that's weighing him down. This stuff gets expanded on as the game goes along and recontextualizes his relationship with the main character Lloyd. Obviously, this is not rocket science. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find a JRPG which doesn't have a similar sort of character arc. But the difference here is how another game might have to hurry through this in order to fit it in a single game alongside a host of other character arcs. Trails from Zero never overloads you with character background or development. It's evenly spaced throughout the game because the game knows it can afford to. In Azure, relatives from Randy's past show up in Crossbell and take part in some crazy shit that results in Crossbell being essentially occupied and the SSS being labeled as fugitives. His family members end up on the other side of the battle lines drawn in this conflict, and overcoming them is part of the main story's final stretch in taking back Crossbell. Randy also receives some more development throughout the first part of the game as he wrestles with balancing his new life with people trying to drag him back into his old. Again, this isn't complicated stuff, but this sort of thing works so well in Trails for two reasons. First, as previously mentioned, the game can take its time knowing that it has multiple games to work with in which to finish character arcs. Second is how the series interweaves the conclusion of character arcs in with the main story. With Randy, he has to face down his relatives and in doing so reaffirms his decision to abandon his old life in favor of his new. With Wazi, he has to confront the people he left behind and what his abandoning did to them. With Noelle, she has to critically think about right versus wrong rather than following orders. With Kia, she has to balance what she wants to do versus what she needs to do. With Arios, he has to learn how to balance ends and means, and so on and so on. All of these characters, slowly built up over multiple games, see their character arcs completed and paid off at the same time as the main story hurtles towards its conclusion. This is done so masterfully that the final few chapters in Azure, as well as Trails in the Sky SC, represent some of the most addicting and satisfying JRPG experiences ever made. Let's talk about Sky SC as another example. Again, spoilers incoming, the game's 20 years old, go play it. Sky SC is notable in how absurdly thorough it is at concluding character arcs while keeping the story focused on the relationship between Joshua and Estelle. Essentially, every playable character gets a time to shine in the latter half of the game. Olivier has his identity revealed as false at the same time his character and principles were revealed as genuine. Tita and Agate establish a brother-sister bond as Agate finds himself weaker than he thought and Tita finds herself stronger. An extremely well done relationship that the later titles would completely ruin, but that's not the point. But rather than go through all of those, let's look at how the game balances those moments with the story more focused on its main characters. Sky is in essence a story that revolves around Estelle and Joshua, and this is reinforced at the end of Sky SC when the conclusions of other character stories serve as reflections of them. To summarize for those who haven't played, Joshua was adopted into Estelle's household when he was around 10 years old, prior to which he served as a child assassin for an organization called Ouroboros. This organization shows up in Sky SC to serve as the primary antagonists. Two of the main party members, Scheherazade and Zin, have counterparts in Ouroboros that serve as some of the last antagonists in the game. Much like Joshua and Estelle, these counterparts were once family, or at least close to it. And so as the game moves towards its conclusion, the player is sort of confronted with what would happen if that same situation had gone slightly differently. This then informs how they act with two other members of the society, Ren and Louve, and how they attempt to bring them back from the edge. At the risk of sounding redundant, what this accomplishes is the conclusion of main characters' arcs being interwoven with the arcs of other party members and the main story as a whole. This is the type of thing that sounds like it should be simple, but so few games accomplish it to this degree. And the reason Trails is able to do this is due to its deliberate pace, multiple game structure, and just flat out good writing. I could keep going with examples of this, but I think it's probably safe to say if what I talked about sounds good, play the games and see for yourself. Let's circle back to Azure. Part of the reason I think it works so well here is because of a strength that's somewhat unique to it compared to the rest of the series. While Trails in the Sky had a somewhat generic fantasy setting, Crossbell represents a much more unique and much more confident setting. The city itself represents a hub throughout both Zero and Azure, and even when outside the city, most conflicts tend to loop back to Crossbell. This is another benefit of the two game structure. After learning about the setting and subsequently saving it in Trails from Zero, it's impossible to not have some attachment to the city. With the first storm weathered, seeing the city once again taken over by scheming dicklords serves as an extra kick in the teeth and pushes the player towards desiring a happy ending. This is a result of having played 2 games worth of quests from the people around the city, ranging from the important to the seemingly menial. There's also a host of small details, like the fact that almost every NPC is named and has dialogue that changes each chapter. Crossbell is just a well-realized setting that sort of ties the whole thing together. In my Trails from Zero review, I sort of backed off from giving it a blanket recommendation because of the slow pace and emphasis on story, but I've kind of changed my stance on that with more thought. Obviously no game is for everyone, but because of its unique strengths and how it represents the best of a pretty damn good franchise in Trails, I think just about anybody who's a fan of JRPGs should give Zero and Azure a try. There's just unique strengths to it that help execute the concept of character-based stories more than any other franchise I can think of. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please leave a comment and consider subscribing. It lets me know people are interested in this type of content.